Part 3. Practice specificity. Everything so far has pushed toward variety. Vary the movement, mix the order, embrace the mess. So this part may feel like whiplash, because specificity is, on its face, the opposite idea, that practice should match the test as closely as possible. Hold both in your head. By the end of this section, they'll fit together rather than fight. The section goes like this. First, the specificity hypothesis itself, and how old and well-rooted it is. Then, the 3 specific characteristics for which the evidence is strongest, the 3 things that really do need to carry over from practice to test, the sensory information available, the performance context, and the cognitive processing demanded. Then, the reconciliation. How can variability and specificity both be true? The answer is that they govern different aspects of practice, and once you see which is which, the apparent contradiction dissolves. And we'll finish with a genuinely strange and delightful phenomenon, special skills, that show specificity operating right inside a varied class of movements. Let's start with the hypothesis and its long history.
The specificity of practice hypothesis is one of the oldest ideas in all of learning, and it states something that sounds almost obvious. The best learning happens when the characteristics of practice match the characteristics of the test. Its roots run deep. Over a century ago, Thorndike proposed the identical elements theory to explain transfer. The more elements 2 situations share, the more transfer between them. And in the study of motor abilities, Franklin Henry argued that abilities are specific and task-bound rather than general. So performance on 2 skills depends on how much they truly share. Put those together, and you get the specificity hypothesis. Practice the thing, in the way, in the conditions you'll be tested. Now, you should feel the tension immediately. Part 1 and Part 2 just spent the whole hour telling you to vary the movement, to not just practice the exact test version, to scramble the order. And here's a venerable principle saying, make practice like the test. Both of these are well supported by evidence. So either the field is contradicting itself, or more likely, these 2 principles are actually talking about different parts of practice. Hold that puzzle. To solve it, we first need to see exactly which characteristics specificity really applies to. And there are 3. The first is the senses. The first characteristic where specificity clearly holds is sensory and perceptual information. The key research is by Proteau and colleagues, and the finding genuinely reversed an old assumption. People used to think that early in learning you rely heavily on vision, but as you get skilled, vision matters less, and you shift to feel, to proprioception. Proteau showed close to the opposite. Learning is specific to the sensory information that was available during practice. So if a learner practices with vision available, vision becomes a built-in part of the skill and stays essential. And if you take vision away on a later test, performance drops, even for well-practiced people. In fact, the more you practice with vision, the more you come to need it. The skill you built is a with vision skill, not a generic skill. The practical implication is sharp. Practice under the sensory conditions of the test. If a patient or athlete will have to perform without visual feedback, without a mirror, in the dark, with eyes on something else, then at least some practice has to happen under those same sensory conditions, or the skill won't be there when the vision isn't. You can't practice with one set of senses and assume it'll transfer to another. The senses you practice with become part of the skill itself.
The second characteristic is the performance context, the environment surrounding the skill. And this one is subtle and a little eerie. It builds on the encoding specificity principle from memory. You retrieve best in a context resembling the one you learned in. David Wright's research extended this to motor skills and showed something remarkable. Learners pick up incidental features of the practice environment that they were never told to learn and weren't even aware of learning. In his studies, sequences were secretly color-coded. People learned the color associations without knowing it and performed better at test when those colors were present. The everyday versions are vivid. The mirror in a dance studio or a weight room becomes part of what's learned. Perform on a mirrorless stage or competition platform, and you're worse, because a cue you'd unknowingly come to rely on is gone. And the home field advantage in sports is partly this. The home team has incidentally learned the cues of their own venue. The implication for you as a practitioner, deliberately build the test's context features into practice. If a rehab patient needs to walk in a crowded mall, then once they're ready, therapy should include walking in a crowded mall. Whatever will surround the real performance should, as much as possible, surround the practice. The context leaks into the skill whether you intend it to or not, so choose it on purpose.
The third characteristic is the one people forget: the cognitive processing, the thinking the skill demands. This is the idea of transfer-appropriate processing, and it says the best practice requires the same kind of mental work that the test will require, regardless of how physically similar the movements are. If the real situation demands rapid decisions, a soccer player reading a closing defender and deciding in a split second to dribble or pass, then practice has to include rapid decision-making, not just clean execution of the pass in isolation. The thinking you do in practice becomes part of the skill. There's a clean demonstration by Pelakia. People practice standing balance on an unstable surface. One group just balanced, another balanced while counting backward by threes, adding a cognitive load. A week later, everyone was tested while doing the counting task. The single task group, who'd practiced balancing without the mental load, got noticeably wobblier when the load was added. The dual task group, who'd practiced with the load, held steady. The cognitive demand of practice had become part of what they learned. So the lesson extends specificity beyond the body and the room to the mind. If the test will tax attention and decision-making in a certain way, practice has to tax it the same way. Match the thinking, not just the movement. Now we have all three pieces. Let's resolve the puzzle.
Now, let's resolve the apparent contradiction, because it's resolvable and the resolution is clarifying. Variability says vary your practice. Specificity says match the test. How can both be right? Because they govern different aspects of practice. They're not fighting over the same territory. Variability is about the movement. Practicing several movement variations builds a flexible, adaptable skill that transfers to novel versions. Specificity is about the surrounding characteristics, the sensory information available, the performance context, and the cognitive processing. These should match the test because learning is tied to them. So the combined sophisticated prescription is this: vary the movement, but match the senses, context, and thinking. Vary what should flex, hold constant what should stay the same. Practice the tennis return against many serve speeds and placements. That's variability of the movement. But practice with the same kind of vision, in a setting like the match, demanding the same fast reads the match will. That's specificity of the senses, context, and cognition. Far from contradicting each other, they're two halves of a complete answer to the question, what should practice look like? One tells you what to make different. The other tells you what to keep the same. And there's one last phenomenon that captures both at once, sitting right at their intersection. Let me end the content with a genuine curiosity that lives right where variability and specificity meet: especial skills. Keach and colleagues studied skilled basketball players shooting from many distances. As you'd expect, accuracy fell off smoothly the farther they got from the basket, except at one spot. At the foul line, players shot dramatically better than the smooth distance curve would predict. A little spike of excellence at exactly the distance they'd shot thousands and thousands of times. They even covered the court markings to rule out visual cues, and the spike remained. The foul line shot had become, in their word, especial, set apart from the class of shooting movements by sheer specific practice. The same thing has been found with skilled baseball pitchers, who are unusually accurate from precisely the regulation pitching distance. Why is this such a lovely note to end on? Because it shows both of our principles operating in one skill. The smooth accuracy curve across all distances reflects a general, variable, shape-alike capability. Variability. But that one privileged spot, far better than the rest, is pure specificity, the fingerprint of massive practice at one exact version. A class of varied movements with one especially grooved version inside it. Variability and specificity in a single jump shot.
That brings part 3 to a close, so let me gather it. The specificity hypothesis says learning is best when the characteristics of practice match those of the test, an old idea, rooted in Thorndike's identical elements and Henry's specificity of abilities. 3 characteristics carry over and deserve your attention: the sensory information available, the surrounding performance context, and the cognitive processing the skill demands. Match those to the test. And crucially, specificity doesn't cancel variability. They govern different parts of practice. Vary the movement, match the senses,
the context, and the thinking. Special skills, like that uncanny foul line accuracy, show both principles living inside a single class of movements. Keep that pairing in mind as we close. To bring the whole chapter together, the next 3 sheets each translate this science into one profession you might actually work in, so you can see the same principles wearing the clothes of a real job. This first one is for occupational and physical therapists. Notice how it reframes everything for rehabilitation. Variable trial-and-error practice over errorless drilling, varying the regulatory and non-regulatory conditions a patient will meet at home, random over blocked scheduling for retention, and matching the senses and context of the patient's real environment. The motor learning principles don't change, only the setting does.
This second sheet is the coaching version, the same science applied on the field and the court. Look at how it lands the big ideas for a coach. Variable practice beats constant repetition. Go random rather than blocked, even though it looks worse in the moment. Vary both regulatory and non-regulatory conditions to match competition. And treat errors during early practice as a feature, not a failure. And the warning we kept returning to is right there. Beware the false mastery of smooth blocked practice. And the third sheet is for movement instructors more broadly. PE teachers, dance, and skill instructors. It pulls together the whole arc of the chapter. Design strategic variability, vary regulatory and non-regulatory conditions, schedule for long-term retention with random practice. Watch out for the metacognition trap, where practice feels productive but isn't, and apply contextual interference, so the brain reconstructs the action plan each trial. 3 professions, 1 science, which brings us to the takeaways.
Let me land us with the 3 things to carry out of this room. First, vary the practice. Variable practice, and even the errors that come with it, build a skill that transfers to new situations, while drilling one version over and over feels productive and teaches less. Second, mix up the order. The contextual interference effect is real and robust. A random schedule looks worse during practice, but wins on retention and transfer, for beginners and experts alike. So resist the smooth, blocked practice that flatters everyone and trust the retention test instead. Just ease children and true beginners in gently. And third, match what matters. Specificity isn't the enemy of variability. Vary the movement, but match the senses, the context, and the thinking of the real test. The master principle that ties the whole chapter together is this: vary what should flex and keep constant what should stay the same. Or even simpler, practice for the game, not for the practice. The practice session is never the point. The future performance is. Design backwards from there, and you'll build skills that actually show up when they're needed. Thanks, everyone. Go make your practices a little messier, a little more game-like, and a lot more effective. See you next time.